So, welcome to, I believe we're live, and welcome to this week's The Human Element. This week we're going to be looking at the part 2 of our three brains, where we look more closely at what and how of those three drivers that we talked about last week. These three drivers are hardwired into our brains. They steer our conversations and build or make problematic our relationships. And we mentioned last week that we think of them as the lizard brain, that's the survival stuff, the limbic, which is the social, emotional, and the logical parts of our brain, the cognitive and language-based parts of us that we think our lives, the way we think about our lives and our days and everything that's going on. Today, we're going to explore these drivers and how they impact our everyday lives and our relationships. Then next week, what we're going to do is to discuss a little bit about how conversational recipes or building our soft power skills can help us master the tougher moments in our relationships, the high stakes negotiations, or the difficult conversations that we have with our loved ones at different times. We'll be looking at ways to boost our emotional intelligence and so strengthen these relationships. Now, what we're doing here is we're trying to dive into what is common everyday experience of everybody. We have emotions. They affect us in our day-to-day life. What we like, what we don't like, how we feel about somebody, what we're thinking about somebody underneath the surface, even if we've got a smile on our faces and are saying other things to them. I mean, we've got this part of this deep ocean related part. You know, I guess I refer to this a little bit akin to the ocean, because 2/3 of the earth is the ocean. 2/3 of who we are is kind of below the surface. Anyway, paying attention to this often complex emotional landscape, but understanding that these are natural, they're hardwired into us that's allowed us to survive as long as we have, that has given us the capacity to bond and relate and have feelings about and values about things in our life. And then how our thinking about our rational and logical minds, to the extent that we utilize them, and the way we craft and create new ideas, new plans, make decisions, and all of that ideally for the better. But we're going to be looking more at some of the specific tools that we can use to help us better use this simple reality of who we are, i.e. these three main drivers. But today, what we really want to start to do is look more carefully at these three drivers. Again, remind ourselves what they are from what we spoke about last week, but also really to then see how knowing about these three drivers can help us. Not always making that connection and seeing that it's meaningful, and seeing then how this understanding of who we are as, you know, this human element of these three drivers in us is useful. Or is it just, interesting, but now let me get on with real day-to-day life. I've got things to do. So how does knowing that we have these three brains help us? So Marilyn, again, this is Marilyn Morris, and my name is Karen Judd Smith, and we're here to tease out some of these aspects of the human element. We refer to more generally as the human element, but oftentimes we bring them with us into each and every relationship. But sometimes actually, a lot of the time, we don't utilize them as well as we might. And so how does understanding that they exist that they're at play in our lives. How is this relevant to us? So I'm going to hand it back to you at the moment, Marilyn, just because part of it is talking about these things so that we can better understand what we really mean and why is it important? Why is it even though it's a hard to talk about topic because we kind of do it all the time, but don't realize we're doing it all the time. How can we make use of this? How is it relevant to our daily lives?
Well, for me, I have a reflection of that, or a observational experience over 20 plus years of my professional life, working in the healthcare setting as a board certified chaplain, and hundreds of times, more than several thousand times in the span of that 20 plus year career, was present with families under crisis, i.e. threatened.
Yeah.
And especially in the emergency room at the moment of, receiving bad news or anticipating bad news while they were waiting to find out the outcome of their loved one in an emergency room procedure, or in the intensive care or neonatal intensive care. All of those, I was an intensivist. So I was involved in a lot of these very emotionally heightened circumstances. And the interesting thing that when I came upon then this understanding that you taught in one of your courses, in several of your courses, it all clicked. I went, aha, that's exactly what I was observing with families. First was the reaction, and Kubler-Ross documents this quite extensively, and other students of hers, and since then it's been modified a lot. But it is a process that we go through when confronted with something, and there's this, kind of that reactive survival, almost, to push it back somehow or to protect yourself. Even you see it in the body language. And then there's, the emotions arise. At first they don't. There's reaction and the shock, denial, and then emotion. And they name the emotion as anger, but I saw many other kinds of emotions arise. But that process, to see it in seconds and happen in response to either receiving or anticipating, something that would feel threatening. There is that whole process, reaction and then emotion. And then they start to work, on the reasoning part, the beginnings of narrating it somehow, either telling the story of, maybe so-and-so is having a heart attack or whatever. Oh, he was always so intense, and trying to get and make sense of it in some manner, way, or fashion. And the reason why this matters so much to understand this process is that often our narration may or may not fit the actual facts of what's going on, of what we're reacting to and feeling about. We'll make the story to try and fit it so that we can deal with it. So there is out there, a lot of, especially these days, because of the impact of multimedia. And, we're receiving story after story after story after story. And a lot of it's put in the context of alarming us and angering us. Yeah. And I won't mention any particular news media that if you go into a gymnasium is on every other TV and constantly going, but we are being constantly stimulated. This submerged part of our brain is being activated, maybe more so than back in our ancient ancestors' caveman days. I mean, they'd occasionally run across a tiger or a lion or something, that they had to defend against. And so that part of our brain is, 2/3 of us is innate, to be protective, to survive, to react. But these days it's almost like that's being, overly stimulated, and there's a lot of concern about that. But you don't need mass media to overly stimulate. If you're in a difficult relationship with your boss or your spouse, or this teenager who was such a nice kid just a year ago, and now it's like aliens took it over, and you're contending with, this impossible human being. And I did that 3 times over. By the time you get to the third one, you can kind of tamper down the reactive part and the emotional part. And you're like, I'm just going to think my way through this, which is confusing for them because they're targeting that other spots. But anyway, it is fascinating to see that, and to understand that because 2/3 of our brain, we're just using these kind of, but because a large portion of how our brain functions is reactive instantaneously before we have
rational.
It's pre-rational.
It happens faster than we realize. We cognitively realize that it's going on, and it's made that way. Our whole bodily system and functions. If I had to tell my body what to do, I would be dead eons ago.
Exactly.
But luckily we have, but part of the luckily part is that it's important for our cognitive mind to understand that these things are going on without our thinking about it, and those things impact how we feel, and therefore what we then think about things. But when we don't realize or recognize or pay any attention to, or even notice those emotional drivers having an impact on us, we just think that we're thinking logical thoughts and are acting the right way. And we don't see some of the other stuff that we're doing because our cognitive side is just not getting it, just not seeing it, not paying attention to it. Now we can develop that awareness and that attention. And part of that is by bringing into our own cognitive understanding the roles and capacities and importance of those pre-rational impacts on our life. But when we act as if they don't exist, that's when it's problematic.
Exactly. Yeah. And part of that submerged area of our brain is, the pay attention signs, is the red stop sign, is the green go light. It's like, these are important, pay attention. This is meaningful.
Right.
And so they are there as alert systems. But I think becoming aware of that also helps us to understand why most humans are problem biased, problem oriented, and we just double down on the problem and look it over, and get more angry every time the boss comes in and says the same thing that they said 2 days ago, and it's or whatever in our social relationships. We tend to focus on the problem, and we become these problem experts. And that can get in our way too, of finding solutions, of even looking for them, of even saying, I'll set the problem aside and just figure out what to do elsewise. That takes a reworking of our brain, in a sense, or almost like a rewiring to not be so problem oriented and problem focused, and to have a more objective view. It takes an actual practice. You have to build some muscle.
And I put it like, shoelaces pre-existed my kids. Shoelaces pre-existed me. But there's a certain advantage to having shoelaces tied. And so it was good for me to learn how to tie my shoelaces. It took an inordinate amount of time, being a kid, to learn how to tie my shoelaces. But once I did that, once I had that habit, I can mindlessly tie my shoelaces now. Or I find some other shoes I can slip my feet into, but that's a different story. But anyway, but the point there is that I had to learn to tie the shoelaces to get the benefit of the shoelaces. The benefits of having shoes to protect my feet are immeasurable. Learning how to tie my shoelaces before the days when we had, Velcro and now stretchy materials or whatever else, but you still have to learn to put your shoes on and when to put your shoes on. I mean, there are always habits involved, even though those habits may evolve. But the point there is there are benefits to developing habits. And in our relationships, there are benefits to understanding that there are better ways to deal with our problem bias that we do have. The problem bias is not a problem in its ultimate sense. That's what keeps us alive. And we need to value that. And we need to see that there's a place for it. And today, being problem biased and only having that focus, that attention being paid on the reevaluation, redescription, better articulation, capturing all the big data on those problems, that's all very well and good, but that energy put into that is not doing anything useful in terms of addressing that problem. The building of a solution, the building of the skill set to tie the shoelaces, instead of just saying your shoelaces are untied, you're going to trip over, a parent has to teach the child and put the time in once, twice, 3 times, whatever, however many times, to the tying of the shoelaces, i.e. the thing that solves the issue. If they only focus on the condemning, the criticizing, the problem focusing of that problem, then the kid doesn't learn how to tie their shoelaces anymore just because they know they should. It's like, I would, Mom, if only you would teach me what to do. You've heard that.
We can extrapolate that into what we see occurring in the effect of mass media. People almost like cocooning into groups where they go over and over and over incessantly the problems, and often they're political, but they can be social, economic, etc. But they grind the problem down into a grist mill, and it's their daily consumption. And then if someone were to come along and say it can be seen from a different point of view, or actually what you're consuming over and over and over again isn't based on reality or real facts, we see that there's also a protective part of the cognitive brain that, if it's confronted, and I guess this is what many psychologists and experts in the field call the power of propaganda, is once you have this quote unquote information kind of ensconced in your mind, and then new information comes. Many times, because that's kind of painful. Like, I got to open that up and change my mind, and I might be embarrassed, and so you go back into that reactive emotional. That's a crisis, What new information? What I believe isn't true, maybe. And there's like this mental crisis. So you go back to the reactive emotional resistance, and it's called cognitive dissonance. And people just double down on whatever it is the narration in here. That they've come up with.
And another way of looking at that, essentially the same thing, from using slightly different language on that, is, as you said, you talked about a cocoon, this information cocoon. Part of why, I see myself do it. I go into this little cocoon space where people are going over reaffirming why this point of view is so reasonable and is so clearly the correct way of looking at things, that even though all of the information is about this horrible situation, I feel somewhat comforted at the same time that at least I'm not wrong about it. So I've got this, and the minute some other point of view comes in, I'm not only feeling uncomfortable about the story, the consequences of that story and how things will end bad, but then somebody else is challenging my comfort level that at least my thinking about it is the right way to go about thinking about it. That gets challenged. So discomfort upon discomfort. And another fundamental piece of our human nature is we like homeostasis.
Mm-hmm.
We don't like to be out there on the edge. Even if we're a thrill seeker, we only like to be on the edge when we want to be on the edge, or for a little bit of the day, not all day, every day. We like it not too hot, not too cold, just right. We like a little bit of challenge, but not threatening, just right. We seek that homeostasis. So even when we're hearing bad news, we like somehow to be comforted. There's that desire for just some middle ground in everything. And so we're always in this push-pull types of situations. So even in the whether we call it focusing on the problem or our cognitive dissonance, and that's uncomfortable to us. So what we seek to release the tension of that dissonance. We want to go back to a more comfortable middle ground where it makes sense. We just, even at the end of the day, we want to be comfortable at the end of the day. We don't want to be uncomfortable again, even if we're ready to go and do whatever exciting in the morning and get into the melee of life. Still, we seek that. So we've got these parts of us that are constantly pushing and pulling at us in almost everything, because we are human. We have these three brains, these three functions going on 24/7. And just being aware of their existence doesn't solve everything, doesn't solve each problem that is presented to us, but it gives us a better, at least the conceptual part of our brains. It allows us to understand some of the dynamics that we're seeing, the reasons for the dynamics, the desire to understand. We have that powerful desire to understand in our own framework, which differs from person to person. But it's helpful to understand why, and I'll just go back really quickly to this concept of the boat on the water and the deep currents, or a riptide when you go swimming. People can look out at the water and see that person was a strong, one of the strongest swimmers. They went out and then they disappeared. How could that happen? Why did that happen? He didn't see it coming. I didn't see it coming. What was going on? Somehow there's these underlying forces at play.
Mm-hmm.
And when we don't see them coming, when we don't pay attention to them, it can totally mess us up, putting it nicely. In some cases, it'll demolish a deal. It will demolish a relationship. It can undermine things that have been built and taken years to build in a certain way. Or it can just simply make us end up in a place that we, whoops, I thought I went into the water here. Now I'm 100 yards down the beach. Good grief. Wasn't that exciting? I mean, it can be unthreatening as well, but we tend to pay attention to things when they're more threatening. But at least giving us a way to have the insight, and so that then we've got at least a chance to take them into consideration when it's really important to do so. But I would contend that's actually all the time. But anyway, not just in the critical moments, but that's when we're more likely to notice them and then want to pay attention, want to learn how to do better with them.
Yeah. And Karen, that points to, of course, it'll be another conversation that we'll have because there's so much involved in all of that. But when we're confronted with new information or countered with a different point of view or something that we have to assess, and we feel that rising in us, like, oh no, I'm going to have to change my mind on this. And there is in that conversation, especially if it's in a corporate level and you're dealing with your boss or whatever, but in one of the courses that you teach on negotiation, which you had, I don't know, 25, 30 years of experience in, of all places, the United Nations, where negotiation is how you breathe. But in all of that, there are developing understanding and techniques of using one's emotional, what you say, the soft skills. But it is an emotional shift that we have to make. We have to go into the deeper part of our brain, those currents, and contend with that, like you would with a boat. You have to make the adjustments and the adaptations, because there is a power differential when you have to make that shift and go, well, maybe I didn't see that correctly. And we come to that rather reluctantly, because it creates for that moment an up and down, and I have to take a step down or a step back. That's at least how we see it. But there are techniques actually in conversation with people, where if you develop the kind of the empathic connection, then that power differential is mitigated, and you can remain more equal, and the conversation can go forward, and then so you have less resistance to it, and so will they. In mirroring your less resistance, the people that you're in conversation, they'll also lower their resistance, and then the conversation can move forward in a way that isn't so problem fixated, or isn't about defending my beliefs and my truths, but it's more about coming to an understanding and moving forward and building something together with others. But that's for another time, I imagine.
But just to add on to what you're saying, that's such an important piece to understand, is that there are ways to engage the relationship and bring more things into mind and into our understanding. Why did I say that? Part of what goes on in relationships most of the time, in almost any conversation, in any negotiation, in any engagement with another human being, is that we enter into that moment with a certain viewpoint. And half the time it's very, very simple. I'm coming out of my head, my world, and my concerns. And in that moment, it takes, even like on your computer, it takes a moment for you change to another app. And it takes a moment for that app to kind of come into gear, or for the page to refresh and say, oh, yes, that's where we were. Now, in relationships, a lot of the time, in addition to getting back into gear with that engagement, there's also the simple fact that we do not have the whole picture. So my view of things is that it's my view on what is going on. And there's and it's not a matter of my view being right or wrong, as much as it's incomplete. And there are getting more information and more relevant information is what becomes critical in relationships, because there's an enormous amount of information we could gather, even from the other, but it could be totally irrelevant to the objective at hand. So learning how to gather from the other, from your own depths and from the other, more information from them about the situation that is relevant to what we're addressing. Having that skill is so important, because we can almost guarantee that anytime we engage another person, even though we might have lived with the other person for quite a few years, that on that topic, on that issue, in that moment, we do not have all the information, some of which is really critical information to helping allow the conversation to move forward in a productive way around your goals and objectives. And the goals and objectives themselves may even need to be adjusted. And so how to do all of that process simply, quickly, and easily. So that how can we build habits like tying our shoelaces that we can use in each moment that can help that relationship move forward quickly, better? That's what this is all about. And it's complex, and yet we want to distill it down to simple things like, okay, well, you don't have to get blisters on your feet or wounds on your feet because you wear shoes, and you don't want to trip over the laces. Sorry, you have to live with us growing up with shoelaces is the only ways we put on shoes, just for this instance, whatever, and knowing how in a split second, so that we don't even have to think about it every day. We don't have to labor over the process of tying our shoelaces like we did when we first learned as a kid, that we can do it in an instant, get up and go, and know that our feet are going to be protected in the best possible way. That's the goal with what we're doing here. What we're trying to look at is the importance of understanding how to do these things. Then we'll look at what they are and how to make them as simple as possible, that they can be useful in everyday engagement. That's kind of what we're really trying to do here. So hopefully this will be, we'll add more to this as we look at things next week, as we dig into some of the what to do's, not just it's important to do them. This week, I hope that we help make sense that it is good for us to understand the three drivers. They are at play all the time in our lives, in every situation, whether we're sitting by ourselves in a conversation with our friend, having a crucial conversation with a loved one, or negotiating high stakes deals or agreements, at any level of work or whatever. These parts of us as human beings are at play. They're at play, and we don't see them all. And sometimes that's why we end up saying, oh my God, I didn't see that coming.
What?
What? But hopefully, and those things still will surprise us, but less and less and less. And as we gain that skill set, we won't trip over our shoelaces either. But anyway, this is Marilyn. Did you want to any closing comments, and then we'll head out for this week?
I just think that it's one of the things that we grapple with in all of our human relationships is the understanding that I don't have to come to a conclusion every single time I'm in conversation with somebody. It may end up that we've moved and budged a little bit more in a positive direction. Yeah. And that might be good enough for that conversation, because I like to close things. I can get all done and that's all wrapped up, and then I can move on. Otherwise, I spend time in between conversations with that person because I didn't feel it was satisfactorily closed to my satisfaction. So I just think that understanding that my brain's always going to be rattling. It's always going to be going around and around and around. But coming to that kind of understanding that a conversation is a step in the right direction. Mm-hmm. A good conversation is a step in the right direction, and taking things more piecemeal, and just realizing that every morning I have to get up and tie my shoes every single morning. So living with that fact,
and when your brain
more comfortable. Yeah.
And when your brain keeps going in between, that can be really good when you're looking at, okay, that's what you're doing, a quick assessment. That's what happened. This is where we are. And then thinking about what can be done next.
Mhm.
When we navigate life, time spent at sea, you're constantly, as a navigator, you're constantly assessing where you are. This is what you don't assess where you are and then it's done for the trip. That is work that is done all the time. You constantly got that feedback on your radar, on your sonar, on your Loran. That was back in the old days, or by, triangulating where you are based on your line of sight or whatever it might be. But you have to constantly do that work so you know where you are, so you can chart the best course to where you want to go. So don't feel bad that we're rethinking about the conversation. That's okay, so long as we don't just only go into the problem side, that we also go into, okay, so now what worked? What do we do next?
Yeah, which then points us down the road towards another skill set that we'll have a long conversation, maybe 2 or 3 sessions, I don't know, but it's so important. And that is to be adaptive and yet to also hold steady to the course. And you have a beautiful word for that called transilience, which is transformative resilience, and putting those two together as kind of like a fundamental skill set towards all the other applications, to have better conversations and relationships. And I can't wait till we dig into that, because it's become one of my favorite words. So
anyway, we love to have these conversations because it's in part, it's our way of also finding the ways to explain stuff that we've lived with for a number of years, but to help make it help us articulate it better for others also, not so that we can just be satisfied with our own thinking and make it useful to ourselves. So that's it. We look forward to seeing you next week. And next week, we want to be able to start and look at some of the concept of having recipes for these things, the concept of having little templates for how to deal with situations. And of course, there'll be skill sets associated with that, tying our shoelace type of skill sets. But anyway, we want to try to make things as simple as possible and yet profoundly meaningful. Each one as simple as they may be. We want to make them also very aligned with fundamental principles at play in who we are as human beings. So that's it. Anyway, I'll stop blabbing and we'll move on. We'll see you same time, same place, roughly the same time, same place next week. Thanks very much. And thanks for being here, Marilyn. And
my pleasure.
We look forward to chatting live again next week. Bye.
See you soon.
Oh, me, oh my. Something else